If you want to learn the most powerful layout system of CSS, then you are at the right place. Hello friends, today's video is all about the CSS Grid Layout. So without any further ado, let's dive into and understand the nitty-gritty of CSS Grid Layout. The most obvious question that comes to our mind is, what is CSS Grid Layout? Actually, it's a two-dimensional grid-based layout system that is designed to solve the layout-based problems faced by web developers. It is neither a framework nor a library, but actually it's a feature that is added to the CSS. It allows you to create flexible two-dimensional layouts. Using this, you can even control the size and position of a grid and its content. With the help of spanning capabilities, you can span elements or grid across multiple rows and columns. So this is all about the theoretical aspects of CSS grid layout. Next, we will gonna see the steps that are involved in implementing the CSS grid layout. Actually, there are two steps that you need to follow in order to implement CSS grid. The first step is you need to apply display colon grid CSS property to a div on which you want to apply CSS grid. For example, here you can see that there is a div element, okay, and we want to apply CSS grid property, CSS grid layout to it. So we applied display colon grid to that div element. The second step is we need to specify the width of columns. So CSS property for this is grid hyphen template hyphen columns. So using this CSS property, you specify the width of each column and the values are separated by space. So in our previous div element, we want 3 columns. So I have specified the width of each column separately. So the first column will have 300 pixel width, the second column will have 250 pixel width, and the third column width will be 375 pixels. Okay, these are two steps that you need to follow in order to implement CSS grid. Let me show you by typing some code so that you can understand it in a much better way. Right now I have opened stackblitz.com. So on this platform I'm gonna write the code. Okay, so let's begin. So first of all, I'm creating a parent div. Inside that parent div, I'll be creating the elements to which I want to place them as a grid. Okay, so let's add 10 items. Okay, let me format it, and now let me just apply those two steps that we learned just now. Okay, let me just write display colon grid. Okay, and now let me just grid template columns. Now let's say I want 5 columns, so let me just specify the width of each column separately. The third column will have 150 pixel width, the fourth column will have let's say 225 pixel, and the fifth column will have a width of 50 pixels. As you can see, we have actually let me just make now in this way. So we are having 4 columns right now. The width of first column is 100 pixel, the width of second column is 200 pixel, third column width is 150 pixel, and fourth column's width is 225 pixel. But you might think that, okay, how do I know that these are placed in a tabular manner? So let me just apply some background color and border so that you can clearly see it. So I'm just applying background color. Okay, Let's say the background color is 18885, randomly I have selected that. Okay, border is 1 pixel solid, and that is, oh, typo. Okay, now as you can see that we are having 4 columns, and these all the content of the container is placed in a tabular manner. You can easily see that you can use, this one is our first column, this is our second column, this is our third column, and this is our fourth column. Okay, so these are the 2 steps. If you're going to follow that, you will definitely place your content in a tabular manner. So apart from this, there are other CSS properties that you must be aware of, so that you can apply the spanning capabilities of CSS Grid. So let's see what are those other CSS properties. Uh, there are basically many CSS properties that are provided by CSS Grid Layout, but actually in this video I'll be focusing on just 5 CSS properties, because the other properties are used very rarely, and these 5 properties are used quite often. The first property is grid template columns, the second one is grid template rows, the third one is grid column, the fourth one is grid row, and the fifth one is grid gap. We have already interacted with grid template columns, so let's understand this CSS property in a much more detailed manner. So it is used to specify the width of each column. Here you can specify the value in 4 different ways. If you don't know the width of column, then use auto. When you know the width of a column, then simply specify the value like 500 pixel. And one of the interesting thing about CSS Grid is it has introduced a new unit, which is FR, fractional, and 1 FR means 1 part of the available space. Okay, one more thing that you need to understand is when the columns have same width, then rather than writing the same value again and again, you can use repeat function. This function takes 2 arguments, the number of columns and the repeat value. So let me just show you how to specify the values to grid template columns in the 4 different ways. Here we have specified the particular value to the columns. So let's use auto. Now as you can see that let me just reduce the width of the fourth column so that you can understand. As you can see that the first column's width is 100 pixel, fourth column width is 50 pixel. All the remaining space is divided equally among these 2 columns. Okay, now I have written auto twice, so instead of this I can write repeat. How many times do I want to repeat? I want to repeat it twice. What value do I want to repeat? Auto. I can even write that same code in this way. Okay, instead of auto I can even use FR, that will produce the almost the same result. Okay, you might think that, okay, what is the difference between auto and FR if both are same? If you are using CSS Grid Layout, then I would suggest you to use FR instead of auto. So this is all about the CSS template. This is all about grid template column. Okay, let me just show you how grid template rows work. Okay, let's say I want the width of first row. I want the height of grid template rows is used to specify the height of rows. Okay, let's say I want the height of first row to be 200 pixel. So just by writing this, you can see that just by specifying 200 pixel, the width of first row has become 200 pixel. Okay, let's say I want the width of the height of second row as 100 pixel. Okay, so in this way I can individually specify the height of each row. So this is all about the grid template columns and grid template rows. Okay, so these are some valid examples. Okay, I have already covered this stuff. Okay, now now we're gonna learn how we can use spanning capabilities of CSS Grid. This layout system provides us two CSS properties: grid column and grid row. So grid column and grid row. Grid column is used to span the columns. Here you specify the column which a grid will occupy. The syntax of grid column is grid hyphen column colon start column forward slash end column. So start column means on which column you want to start displaying your item, and end column means on which column you want to stop displaying your item. It also represents the number of columns to span. Might seems confusing, so let me just clear you how you can apply this. Okay, let's say, let me just remove this grid template rows. Okay, and let me just apply one FR to, let me just apply one FR to all the four columns. Okay, now let's say I want my second, that this element, I want my this element to span across three columns. So how can I do this? Simply uh, let me just create a 5-column grid so that you can understand it in a better way. Okay, now I want this element to span across 3 columns. It must start from the second column and should go till 4th column. Okay, so how can I do this? All you have to do is use grid hyphen column. So the first value, what does that mean? The first value specifies, the first value represents the starting column. So from where I want to start, I want to start from second column. Okay, till where, how many columns do I need to span? I need to span 3 columns. That's it. Okay, so in this way you can span the multiple columns. Okay, instead of writing span 3, I can also write 5. Okay, 5 means the starting point of the 5th column. The second value actually represents the starting point of the column where you want your grid to span. So in our case, it seems to be confusing, so that is why you should use a span instead of specifying a particular value. So in this way you will be very much clear that okay, I want my column, I want my grid to span across 3 columns, so use a span. Okay, so in this way you can span your grid across multiple columns. Okay, with the help of grid row, you can span your grid across multiple rows as well. Let me just show you. If I write grid hyphen row, from where I from where this grid, this element should start. Let's say I want this element to start from row 1 and it should span 3 rows. Here you can see that this div has span across 3 columns and 3 rows. You can even span this grid element across 2 rows. So in this way, you can span a grid across columns and rows. Now, as you can see that all our items are placed close to each other. So if you want a gap between them, then you have to use another CSS property of grid layout. Let me just show you what are those. Now there are 3 CSS properties that are provided by this grid layout. The first one is grid column gap is used to specify the size of gap between columns. Grid row gap is used to specify the size of gap between rows, and grid gap is actually a shorthand for grid column gap and grid row gap. Let me quickly show you how you can apply this. Yeah, so grid column gap, let's say I want 10 pixel gap between each column, so you can see that now the columns are having a gap of 10 pixels. Grid row gap, let's say I want a gap of 5 pixels between rows. Okay, so rather than writing these two values, these two row gap and column gap separately, I can use the shorthand notation, which is grid gap, and specify the values in a one go. And let me just remove them. Now you can see that, so this works in the same manner. So this is all about the CSS grid layout. Okay, now let's build a layout like this so that you can better apply the knowledge that we have just learned. Okay, so let me just remove this. Okay, I want a header. Okay, I want navigation div. I want content div. Let's add sidebar div. Okay, let's add footer div. Let me format the code. Okay, now you can see that. Let me also okay, yeah, we are done with the HTML stuff. Now let's apply CSS. As you can see that in the layout, you can see that it's almost this layout is having 5 columns. So I have already mentioned 5, and I want that all these 5 columns should have equal space. Okay, let's remove the gap right now, and let's apply the CSS property to each individual component. So as you can see that our header is spanning across 5 columns. So grid hyphen column 1 span 5. Okay, let me just apply the background color to it, 1E88E5. Okay, let me just quickly apply border to it. Okay, and text hyphen align, that is center. So we are done with the header part. Now let's apply CSS to nav component, navigation component. So grid column 1. Okay, now let me just quickly copy these properties so that I don't have to write it again. Okay, now let's update the content part. Let me quickly change the background color of this. Okay, and I want this grid to span across two columns. So okay, let's quickly modify the sidebar component. Okay. Mm. Now let me change the background color of it. 90 CAF9. Okay. Okay. Now let's apply CSS property to the footer. Let me quickly check what happened. It's not working. Oh, I made one mistake. I want the sidebar to occupy the fifth column. So there you go. Now now it will work. Okay, and let me just quickly change the background color of navigation. Okay, now let me just change the height of these components so that you can understand it in a much better way. Okay, so I have updated the height of each column, height of each row, sorry. So this is the actually the layout that we want to build. So this is all about the today's session. If you have found this video useful, then hit the like button and leave the comments if you have any question, and don't forget to subscribe my YouTube channel to keep receiving such an amazing, useful and knowledgeable video.